Welcome to this recording of Sprout Lab's webinar on Instructional Design 101. Our webinars are really interactive experiences, and we find if we record the actual live webinars, people are less likely to respond on the whiteboard and put information into chat. So what I do with these is really record the bits where I talk, as well as now also do a summary of what happens on the whiteboard, because there's so much great participation in those. First of all, a bit of an introduction to me. I'm Robin Pettard. I'm Director of Sprout Labs and also a Principal Consultant with Learned. These two businesses sort of work side by side. Sprout Labs really specializes in developing platforms to help people design and deliver learning ecosystems. Learned is more at the strategy level that helps people architecture and think through how learning ecosystems work. Today, I'm going to be talking about what does an instructional designer do, introducing some basic frameworks, and doing something I don't quite often do, which is actually talk about learning theories. I'm going to talk about the instructional design process that most people know, briefly talk about some hints and tips about visual design and media, and then finally wrap up with a little bit of a discussion around authoring tools. So I'd like to ask this question about what makes a great learning experience at a lot of the workshops and a lot of the activities and professional development activities that we do. It really sort of helps to frame and bring out what people see as really great learning. Because I think we know what great learning looks like, even if sometimes it's not what we experience. Had a really fantastic response during the webinar to this. A few keywords come back as I look at the notes: engaging, interactive, and experiential. It's really interesting from my point of view, because engaging is one of those overused words in learning, and it has a sort of so much sort of meaning now that's confused. That people, when you sort of sit there and go, well, what does engaging look like? Normally you can actually articulate what engaging doesn't look like. It's actually learning that's irrelevant for what people want to do. It's irrelevant learning that's irrelevant to their job role. And then it's also, particularly in its delivery, really actually not particularly engaging. So if you're listening to this as a recording, you are going to be in the spot where you're listening for me ranting for 20 or 30 minutes. That isn't particularly engaging as a learning experience. I know as a learner, I quite often find when I listen to things or watch things for a long period of time, I need to be in a spot where I actually have more things happening, and I can't stop and pause and come back to them. So the format can be actually not engaging by being not interactive and just really an information dump. The thing that we talk about engagement is that an engaging is when people need that knowledge, need the skills, need the new capability, when they want and really need it, and you're really meeting a need of what the learner and what the organization wants, really switches things around. So in this particular webinar, we're following through Jeff. He's an instructional designer in an insurance company, and we're really going to follow what he does during the day. One of the things that's really important with instructional design is it's not about content. People associate learning and e-learning especially with content, with information. Quite often on the web, what we're doing is we're constantly consuming content. Learning's a process, it's a behavior, it's a change in thinking pattern, it's a change in doing it, a change in performance. That change in performance actually happens through a process. It doesn't just happen through a behavior. It used to be that content is king. I think in the learning process is king. So what does an instructional designer do? This is a really common question when we're starting to talk to people who are launching into thinking about digital learning, and we start to talk about what's needed to be able to produce even half good digital learning. And they sit there and go, so what? Instructional designer? I've never heard of an instructional designer. So here's my attempt at sort of mapping out a little bit of what an instructional designer does. They design learning activities. They sequence those learning activities in a way that makes sense. They quite often design interfaces, and then they also now really focus on designing measurements as well. Lastly, they also do sometimes design text and media as well. They're not information designers, they're experiential designers, designing learning process. One of our instructional designers, Clint Smith, talks about his passion and love for instructional design is because it's a renaissance skill. It's something that involves lots of different areas, lots of different knowledge. It involves storytelling, media, this interactive design element, this user interface element, and it's about bringing these all together into a way that actually meets a business outcome and transforms someone's performance. Now you can see that I've got this line here. And below this line is actually a set of skills that used to be more development skills and the e-learning developer. Now with a whole lot of rapid development tools, e-learning development is actually a whole lot easier in terms of interaction building. And there's a new type of instructional designer that came about that I call the e-learning superhuman. Quite often they're found in in-house development teams. And these people do both the work around the top, building the learning experience, and also actually physically do the development work as well. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that someone Jeff has in particular in this one as well. Now, that's what an instructional designer does, but what does a great instructional designer do? You heard me talk about it a couple of times on that last slide. They really focus on business outcomes and measuring performance. They're a natural born storyteller. Stories are actually how we quite often remember and sort things. They're system thinkers because quite often the problems that they're dealing with aren't solvable by one small design interaction. It needs quite often more of a systems thinking and an ecosystem approach to design a learning solution. So this is the thing, they really design experiences, not resources. Our brains are visual. We are visual people, and also a great instructional designer knows how to communicate visually. This doesn't actually mean sometimes that they're actually a visual designer. They just know how to, they can sit there and be at a spot to go, well, this particular concept needs to be explained by a flow chart, and the flow chart needs to be this type of flow chart. There might not be this person who will make that look great, but they can at the spot that they can know what is the right type of visual medium at the right moment. Now, I'm going to do something I don't normally do when I'm giving introductions to learning design and instructional design. I'm going to talk about some learning theories. Quite often I just focus on the frameworks. And I sort of felt like in this particular webinar, I had to sort of touch on some theory. Some people find theory really useful. Some people find frameworks really useful. And that's one reason why I'm touching on both. To be honest, I don't particularly find theory useful. I find frameworks more useful than processes. So the three big ones are behaviorism, continuitism, and constructivism. Behaviorism really started to develop in the 1950s. It's really the notion and idea that learning is an acquisition of a behavior. Quite often it's about seeing a behavior, then someone practicing, and then getting a reward for that behavior. Skinner did a whole lot of research and work with animals of if you do this and you get a reward, that behavior then becomes wired into someone's behavior. Continuism, which I'm mispronouncing, sorry, is more about people learning by developing their mental thinking processes. How they think about it is actually what is happening, and that's how things are cemented into behavior and memory. And learning is really a process of developing that thinking process. Instructional design techniques that focus on this are things like building process maps, building mental models, reflective thinking. The learning theory that's more common now is constructivism, that learning is really different for everyone. And there's been some neuroscience research actually prove that if someone particularly learns a new behavior that might be physical or mental, or that literally people's brains are wiring and firing in different ways. The instructional techniques for this then become more about a guided process of knowledge construction, that people build their own understanding of how it works. I'm sure we've all seen in a classroom situation where a facilitator may say A, and then someone reflects that back in their language. And as they're doing that thing of reflecting back in their language, they're transferring from what they know already into the new knowledge and putting it in their own words and building their own knowledge construction for that. Now, I think learning is actually a bit more eclectic than just these theories. I think it's quite often a combination of all three, and particularly some particular learning challenges really involve one more than the other. So it's about sort of trying to figure through, well, what type of learning is this? Which type of strategies are working best, rather than which particular learning theory is now the contemporary one. Back to Jeff's day. So we're going to follow through Jeff doing 4 things. He's having an analysis meeting with a risk manager about a new module. Talk a little bit more about what I mean by analysis. He's writing a storyboard, and then he's actually being an e-learning superhuman and doing the visual design and build of a unit and storyline. He's also got to do a review by the end of the day. Now, Jeff's in the meeting with the risk manager, and he's asking lots of questions. In his life, he's actually feeling like that's what he mainly does in the world. He asks lots of questions. One stage, we had a HR graduate that was working with us, so doing some evaluation and research work. And she was asking sort of, what does an instructional designer do? And I talked about the role, and this particular person just sat there and went, so they must have asked lots of questions. And I went, yeah, in actual fact, they do. And quite often, especially during the early stages of projects, I feel like I just bombard people with questions. So drilling at, well, what really is happening here? What does great performance look like? How does this really work? What goes right? What goes wrong? And often the role of the instructional designer is to be the learner, to ask the dumb questions, to be in the spot, to sit there and do a whole, well, I have to learn how to do this. You're throwing a whole lot of jargon at me that I've never heard before. And then the instructional designer needs to be at a spot where they need to think through, well, what sequence does this jargon, what sequence does these concepts come in? How do I build up someone's understanding so they're at the spot where they're really able to be an expert, just like the person that's in front of me? And I think in instructional design, it's one of those things, there's never any dumb questions. And quite often, the dumb questions that an instructional designer can ask can actually be the most insightful things and reveal the most powerful insights to what's really happening. I can't give an instructional design 101 session without talking about the ADDIE model. And the ADDIE model is really the accepted model that quite often is really used in doing course design. At Sprout Labs, we do lots of work around designing 70-20-10 models and learning ecosystems, and we use a slightly different version of the ADDIE model. If you're from a design background, you'll be sort of familiar with the notion of understanding, designing, prototyping, and then exploring. ADDIE is very similar to that. This conversation that's happening at the moment with the risk manager, with Jeff, is really at this analysis stage where he's drilling into, well, what really needs to be happening here. And then he'll move into doing design work that might be, first of all, the learning strategies, and then thinking through the storyboard. Then that's developed, implemented, and then we actually think that evaluation's at the middle of everything. That it should be part of the design phase and the analysis phase, and sort of all the thing that sort of holds it all together. A really nice framework for this sort of putting evaluation and business outcomes at the center is Kathy Moore's action mapping process. So she has this really nice framework for explaining instructional design. First of all, you think through what the business outcomes are, what the people need to do to then be able to meet those business outcomes. Then once we've figured out what people need to do, what the behaviors are, what the thought patterns are, how can you build activities that allow people to be able to practice those new behaviors? And then thinking through the sequencing of those, well, what are the easiest things that people do? And then finally, you put together some information, and they might be job aids. Now, to be clear, a procedure is normally not a job aid. It's normally more detailed than that. So job aids are things that you really focus on particularly how people do something. So in a Kathy Moore sort of style course, you're actually in a spot where the instructional designer designs the activities first, and then quite often has the job aids as a separate entity back over at the side, We sometimes even design a handbook that's actually quite an information dump that people access in a non-linear way to be able to pull out that information and job aids. We also find that also helps to give subject matter experts a security around this approach, because essentially they feel, first of all, like we're emptying the whole courses and the whole programs of content. We're actually taking away the content and making it activity-based and experiential and interactive and hopefully engaging. But we're moving the content to a spot where people are pulling it out rather than being in a spot where they have to access it all the time. This analysis stage is really for us around three things. Figuring out what the business problem is, which is partly what is happening in Kathy Moore's situation. Thinking out what the business problem is, what people need to do, what the activities are, and what the behaviors are. It's also an activity around thinking through who the learners are, profiling those, making sure you're meeting their needs and where they're at. And then there's another thing around figuring out the context. How are people working in the organization? Just making sure you're designing the solution that's the right solution for where they are with their technology, where they are with their culture of learning. A really good example of this is mobile learning. So it's actually sometimes really hard if you've got a group of people who all turn up to the same office every day and aren't required to work in a flexible manner to do mobile learning, because they have no need to do it. They're in front of a computer all day. At the same time, if you've got a really mobile outside workforce, you're probably not in a spot where you're going to be building e-learning where they need to sit in front of a computer for hours on end. At this stage, I opened up to the audience again around what their thoughts on this particular question, about questions Jeff could be asking. If you were, what's the purpose of the program? Who's the audience? Really lovely question, which is, what does high performance look like? And what other outcomes are there? What's the problem you're really trying to solve, to then try to figure out whether or not it's a really a training problem or maybe even a knowledge program. In the perfect world, what would you want to see your employees doing? And then just sort of questions around the learners. Who are they? What's the demographic? How will they consume it? There's things about the context and the learner as well shouldn't be underestimated. And then also there's the timeframes that people have to learn things in to make sure that all slots together. Back to Jeff. Now, Jeff, with his risk manager, also wants to suggest that we look at this from a performance point of view and a performance support point of view. So what's meant by performance support? Performance support is maybe something a little bit more like the job aid. So the notion is that rather than training someone to do something, you support them to do it. There's numerous ways of doing this. It might be sometimes changing the process, changing how a piece of software works. It might be putting different types of instructions on the walls in an area that's doing a process, or it might be changing the instructions that are on a screen if it's software training. Actual fact, you're hearing me use software training as one of the examples, because it's one of those things that's quite often really good for a performance support approach. Bob Mosser has a really nice framework for performance support. It starts with this notion that, in actual fact, there's 5 moments of need for learning. And 5 moments for lead, I sort of think of it as 5 moments of need for when you need to access information as well. The first time, so that's quite often, to be honest, in a course, when you want to learn more, possibly before you've actually done the task for the first time, when you want to apply what you've learned and do it for the first time, then the troubleshooting bit around when things go wrong, and also then when things change. So I opened up to the group to come up with some ideas around this particular one, which isn't an easy thing to do, be in a situation where you actually don't understand the context. So what was really nice in that learning for the first time, a few people talked about the fact that learning for the first time probably needs to be quite structured. It needs to be a course, an online workshop. But if you actually take away and make that into a spot where it's actually more about guiding people through using the job aids and performance supports, it really shifts and changes people's way of working as well. So learning more might be on-the-job support and coaching, and then applying is definitely in that spot where having some job aids and quick guides to be able to access things straight away is really powerful. When things go wrong, online manuals, FAQ, troubleshooting guides. And then when things change, it's sort of an interesting one because it might be things like notifications inside of the application, highlighting things, quick guides to what's different, and then also embedded support and help as well. I think it's a really fantastic way of thinking about helping people do their job better in terms of thinking it through. Some instructional designers in the analysis phase will actually literally figure out is this learning problem really a learn more, or is it really a learning problem about when things go wrong, and then they can work with that, or they actually work with a way where they design a program that actually meets all 5 moments of need and might be 5 sort of smaller bits and chunks of what's now become known as micro learning. So Jeff needs to get back to writing the storyboard. For him, this is great. He doesn't have to be a superhuman and do everything. So what does he mean by writing a storyboard? Well, it's really 3 things that he's doing. Writing the activities, writing the explanations and making decisions about media, when to use images, when to use video, and then writing instructions to the learners. So things like, okay, so now you've just started this module, you're halfway through the program, or other sorts of instructions are, you use this type of drag and drop in this and this way or that way. Back to the ages model, and I open back up at this moment for more interactive activities, and I got some great ideas from people around how to design activities to generate understanding. So a couple of people talked about things like building learning activities, which people have to sort of summarize what they've actually learned and teach that back to other people. And this can be done actually in an online discussion. It doesn't have to be done face-to-face. That's a really nice way of being able to do that. It can be done in sort of a commenting system, a social learning system that might be something that's a follow-up at the end. A few people talked about the fact that it's great to be able to give people tasks like being able to build process maps or mind maps to be able to build and map out their own understanding. A few other people talked about the notion and idea that actually getting people to mentor each other, and peer mentoring is a really great way of being able to get people to develop their own understanding. So essentially, it's a sense of being able to build really active learning activities that sometimes might expand right beyond the 10 in the 70-20-10 model, that are actually working with other people and doing things back in the workplace as well. One of the other things is sometimes we've actually made tasks where people have they've asked them to build job aids, asked them to build checklists that are suitable for doing a particular task. Sometimes it's been really interesting because sometimes those checklists have actually been more useful for the newbies than what the formal checklists have been, which are actually quite often more complicated and actually more suitable for an expert, whereas the ones that the actual learners and trainees use are actually more powerful to be able to unite and enable that. Now back to Jeff. He's really moved on to his virtual teamwork module, where he's been having to be a superhuman. And like many instructional designers, he's in the spot where he's sitting there going, actually, I can do all this learning strategy. I'm an okay writer, but I'm really not a great designer. And this is the spot where we see a lot of people who end up in this superhuman spot really falling down. There's a few tools that can really help Jeff's time to do this. Canva. The Canvas, if you haven't heard of it, is this great online service for building and doing graphic design work. It has lots of really great templates to start with, and then you can buy in things fairly cheaply. Then Powtoons is a great turnaround, simple to use animation tool. When we've worked with developing people's in-house capability in organizations to do instructional design work, both of these tools, we've seen people who are not natural designers to be able to pick these up, work with the templates and build really great looking things and also really great animations using Powtoons. What Jeff finds is working with a desktop authoring tool just really makes it hard to work with other people. Next up, he has to do this review that needs to be done by close of business. Essentially, e-learning is a collaborative process. It's actually no matter what, even if you're the superhuman, you're in a spot where you're working with other people. You're normally not a spot where you're a superhuman and subject matter expert and the person who's going to sign off. You're normally getting people to get feedback on it. But in most cases, it's a team sport, it's a team activity. And really what's starting to happen now, for numerous reasons, is there's a whole series of cloud authoring systems starting to develop. And this is this trend thing that I hinted at the beginning. Most of these cloud authoring systems also come from a background that they're really more about web design and have their roots in web design and able to work in a way where they work across multiple platforms really easily. Things like the Adapt framework and the Adapt builder. Glasshouse is Sprout Labs' own learning experience platform as well. So these are really sort of different tools that allow people to be able to work at things at once. Just subtle things like doing a review process is not so much a process of emailing or uploading. It's just about sending a URL, giving a login, and people are being able to access it. What we find is a cloud authoring systems increase the ability for people to be able to work together. Just the subtleness of not having to shuffle files around and multiple people being able to work on something at once just makes us more able to change and be more agile, quicker. And it really just makes the whole review process a whole lot faster. So just to show you quickly, in Glasshouse, when a reviewer is giving feedback, it's just a matter of doing a very simple selection and comment on it on the pages. The other thing I just sort of hinted at a little bit is these online learning tools and online cloud authoring tools really mean that responsive design is a given. Responsive design is a process where you might design one thing for a desktop. That's what you're looking at on the right-hand side that has a nice sort of map and hotspot, which would be really impossible to use on a mobile device. So on a mobile device, it actually changes. Content's the same, but it becomes a list that's really a lot easier to interact with and be able to engage with on a mobile device. This is really a given, and this is partly because these new cloud authoring tools come from a background of working with pages, not slideshows. And pages are what we're used to on the web. I think of it as there being an old world order and a new world order. The old world order was PowerPoint, slide-based, voiceovers, and dumps. The new world order is more like a website. It's page-based, quite often with free navigation where people can move around, access what they need to do. The new world order, because it's an online thing already, you can actually deliver content from it. So you don't have to go through a process of uploading and downloading and putting it into a LMS. It's naturally more collaborative and also quite often easier to get started with. It's easier to get started with because there's templates in there already and the themes are already there and there's an overall theme and look and feel defines. So if you're someone like Jeff, that makes things a whole lot easier. So just a quick intro. We're at a spot with Glasshouse where we're taking really early people to sign up. We progressively do releases of people who are doing the early signups, and we're getting really close to the spot where it's released to everyone. If you're listening to this in a couple of months' time, you might be able to go to Get Glasshouse and actually just sign up straight away, get your site, and get working within 5 minutes as well. Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to this webinar recording. My contact information is here. Possibly if you're listening to this recording already, you've got my email address because I've sent out this as well. If you've got any questions about instructional design and about Glasshouse and about some of the programs I talked about where we actually help people develop instructional design skills as well, just give me an email message and we can start a discussion. Thank you.